Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice from beautiful Orlando, Florida. And in this video, I'd like to discuss terrorism and the virtual self, or terrorism and the internet. And what I'll do with the books and articles that I discuss is I will go ahead later on and copy and paste in the comment section the references, the reference page, so that anyone who doesn't have access to the course where that is posted can also obtain those references. I know sometimes I've had a few cups of coffee and talk a little bit quick, and if I mention those, you have to write it down and go back, and so this will just make it easier, maybe make the videos go a little quicker, and hopefully that works for everyone, because certainly I want everyone to be able to obtain the sources if they are interested in pursuing the topic further. So I'll start by talking about Gabriel Wyman's book, Professor Wyman's book, which I was able to obtain back in 2006 when it was published, and actually a colleague who is also expert on terrorism, when I told him about this book, he said, "I'm ordering two, one for me, one for him," and we realized this is such an important topic. This was really my first overview, and Professor Wyman just does such an excellent job of giving this comprehensive presentation of terror on the internet. And even though 2006 is the publication date, it's very relevant today. And he also has published articles and other books since. But to me, this is kind of where, for me, it is where it began focusing on terrorism and the internet. Now, I had a lot of prior experience when I worked in the sex crimes field. Starting back in the early 80s, I was helping law enforcement officers decode bulletin board messages. And that's still part of the whole process when we start thinking about terrorism, is decoding, interpreting, understanding meanings systems, the multiple definitions we might have of different words, or the context of the scenarios that are presented. So there's a lot more than just reading it like you would a book or something. But you have to take it that step of interpretation, understanding the cultural context, and a lot of other factors as well we'll discuss. But the internet opened up a vast ability to communicate. So we have propaganda that's presented by terrorist groups. We also have directions on and instructions on how to join and how to assist. Also, there may be virtual training camps that are presented online. In addition to marketing and fundraising and networking, terrorist groups that have websites, and many do, it may work to scare the public as well. And the media will pick up on this and present something. So the terrorist groups are able to reach a large audience with the online environment. They operate these websites similar to other organizations that work in business and industry with some of the same features. Wyman also points out that we have the concerns of cyber terrorism or cyber attacks on different organizations, agencies, or basically structures in that sense, attacking power grids, banking systems, hospitals, etc. Also, there's that psychological warfare that I mentioned somewhat when talking about scaring the public. Also, you have that psychological aspect, but that also focuses on where the terrorists want to target in terms of their audience. The internet is also easy to use, and it's inexpensive to create websites, and the users may hide their identities. And later on we'll talk about the dark web, which is a whole nother area to discuss. Wyman talks about what can be done. And Professor Wyman talks about some of the features, but it's interesting because he mentions that we have to balance security and civil liberties. So, when we think about that, there's that balancing act. And, for example, should these websites be removed? Should terrorist websites be removed? And there's obviously disadvantages and advantages depending on how you view that. Should we spend more time monitoring and sniffing out and tracking terrorist online sites? Should we inform the internet providers that they are hosting terrorist groups or terrorists and expect them to take action? And are there other remedies as well? So, in a sense, if a terrorist group is, I guess one of the things that comes up is that do we want it to become more difficult for law enforcement to track terrorist groups by bringing them into more remote, sites in the dark web, for example? And Wyman, in an article in 2015, published in 2015, talks about the dark web, where lots of illegal activity occurs, pornography, drugs and weapons sales, money laundering, and so on. And there's also legal activities. And terrorist groups move to the dark web to avoid detection and avoid tracking. And so their terrorists are able to communicate with members in a more secure environment. And so it becomes more difficult to see what's going on. Also, Wyman talks about encrypted mobile phone apps such as Telegram, which is a popular one among terrorist groups. This, by the way, this is the 2006 book, Terror on the Internet. I still refer to it frequently, and probably in terms of highlighting the text, probably half of it has yellow highlighting with all the important points I wanted to remember quickly. Basically, I just reread the book. It's really a classic in my view. Anyway, also we see the use of Bitcoin and other types of virtual money that's used, and we also may see other things that are sold, like as organs, oil, and artifacts, antiquities, basically, and those that work in the criminal justice field and terrorism, counterterrorism agencies focus on how to track and develop methods to see what's going on. And so that's interesting area there. Outside of that, when we start thinking about looking at social media, which terrorist groups use frequently, amazing book I found, and this is an older edition. An older edition is Open Source Intelligence Techniques by Michael Bazzell. And this book gives you all kinds of ideas on finding out all kinds of information online using open source techniques, which really I'm amazed how much information he's able to put into a book. He's definitely the expert, one of the experts in this area. So you're reading this book at Starbucks one afternoon, and people say, "What's open source intelligence techniques?" And you kind of try to explain that, and they get a little bit nervous about it. How easy it is to find out so much information about anyone online, or a lot of people, or a lot of things online. It's there, like it or not. Okay, moving on. I wanted to talk a little bit about theory and ideas related to understanding terrorism, but also understanding the online environment. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about an article written by Goldsmith and Brewer, published in 2015, digital drift. And what they have done is they have brought in Professor Mazza's early work from 1964 on delinquency and drift. And their premise basically is that people use the internet and some people drift into different criminal activities. And this also could be applied to victims. But the internet, they state, becomes a proxy partner in that sense in terms of crime. And they talk about the anonymous nature of relationships online, that it's instant, it's open by place or location or geography, and often used as a leisure activity, and also can have that socialization effect through social learning processes. I mean, people give instructions on what to do, what not to do, and so forth in a variety of groups and situations. And we can also look at how people trust others in those online environments and build and maintain relationships, as well as how messages, ideological messages for that matter, may be communicated. And they present two case studies, lone wolf terrorism and pedophilia. So we'll focus on lone wolf terrorism. So there are multiple resources that people could use to obtain information about terrorism and terrorist groups, and also terrorist groups, of course, use these sites to recruit members. And they point out that the lone wolf terrorist may be an improper label to use, because the lone wolf terrorist may be getting a lot of support online. So they're not getting support face-to-face in interactions perhaps, but they're getting that support online. And the idea also is that people can hide their identities. They may feel more comfortable having discussions or talking with each other. I'll just say, look at your local Facebook pages for your, your like local newspapers or your local neighborhood groups. Whew. At least mine it's a mess out there. People arguing, saying bad things, sometimes even using curse language and so on, which you'd never see if people were face to face. I think in a setting they would have much more civil discussions. Anyway, neutralization techniques are used that Sykes and Mazza talk about in their famous article on how juvenile delinquents neutralize or justify or excuse their deviant behavior. And so in essence, a person may self-indoctrinate themselves into the group through this digital drift. And this may be a useful area for counterterrorism researchers and experts and practitioners to look at, to see how do you prevent people from drifting into getting involved in terrorist groups or terrorist activities. So think about all these changes that have occurred since the introduction of the internet, and all the things that have occurred as the internet has become more technologically advanced. Now, when I was in college, we didn't have computers yet. We had calculators. We did have calculators. But computers came later on, and I remember the first time I logged on to the internet, the formal internet, I was already teaching college courses, actually. Now I'd been working, like I said before, assisting law enforcement. Remember using a 1200 baud Hayes modem, which you connected to your phone line and hoped someone in the household or office didn't pick up that line because it would break your connection. And you had these bulletin boards where you would obtain information, little green print on a screen, and then you were able to print that out on your dot matrix printer. And the paper was all attached, and it would go into the behind it, and you'd have a stack, and then you'd have to tear it apart. And so some of you may remember that. Some of you may wonder, what in the world am I talking about? It just sounds like some old man trying to talk about old tech. And yes, but to have seen all that occur over time, and to think about the changes and the changes that it has on people. If you asked me back in 1980 if people would be walking around on cell phones on the street, communicating with each other, texting, sending instant messages, putting up digital photos, using GPS, I would have had no idea. I thought you would be talking about science fiction. So just imagine what things are going to look like a couple years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So we've gone from those monochrome online bulletin boards to live social media with our increasing technology and, of course, complexity. So what are the effects of online environments on people? So now I'm moving away specifically from terrorism and focusing more generally on the internet and social media and online environments. So Abu Dahdeh talks about in the 2011 book, and quote from page 20, the virtual personality is more assertive, less restrained, a little bit on the dark side, and decidedly sexier. And this can lead to aggressive and deviant online behavior and sharing that type of fantasies or discussions with others. And of course, as I mentioned before, think about, do people share stuff online or say things online? Would they say that in face-to-face interactions? And then he talked about the psychological forces and how the boundaries may become more clouded when a person online may have a different sense of their self. I mean, because, think about all the ways people can present themselves, say different things, respond in different ways, take on different characters. Analyzing this almost like an ongoing drama, you see it going on. I'm still trying to figure out what influencers are and how that is relevant to anything. So even I have to learn a lot more to understand all this, but I do understand that marketing, product, and money are a big part of that. Abu Dahdeh also talks about 5 psychological forces that are related to the E-personality, as he calls it. Grandiosity, narcissism, darkness, regression or immaturity, and impulsivity. And I think for practical purposes, we would ask how some of those are related to getting involved in hate groups or terrorism. And continuing this on, Blaskovich and Bailenson in 2011 point out that virtual reality will raise identity switching to whole new levels. So they talk about that, and this is from page 260, a quote. Virtual reality will raise identity switching to whole new levels, from questions of social roles to gender to ethnic or tribal affiliations. Identity will become radically more plastic. That's from their book on page 260. And I think that's just the last part there, radically more plastic. How influential is the online environment in socializing, re-socializing people, or in the case of radicalization, or encouraging someone to join a terrorist group or become a terrorist. In looking at the effects of virtual reality, because we're trying to take a look at the self and socialization in greater detail, they talk about, Blaskovich and Bailenson talk about research showing that those who partake in virtual reality are more likely to believe their virtual or avatar actions. A book that I did not reference, this is a book I read recently because I'm trying to understand more about virtual reality, but it's by Jeremy Bailenson, Experience on Demand, What Virtual Reality Is, How It Works, and What It Can Do. So that was published in 2018. And again, there may be times where we begin to tie this all in a more cohesive manner. All these parts that I'm kind of discussing here. And we can also take a look at what people search for. Google Trends is fascinating. If you have a few minutes, look at Google Trends. I've done some Google Trend analysis before, and sometimes I'll do some stuff. I'll say, "Oh, I want to share this with them," and I said, "Oh, maybe I better not." You get some interesting stuff going on there, and of course, there's a lot more than just looking at a particular trend line regarding a particular search term over a period of time. But you start putting those pieces together, and you can see, what people are fearing, perhaps. People's interest in drugs or alcohol, or people's psychological scenarios, and so there's a lot that can be applied there. I got a lot of those ideas from Augustin Gadom's 2011 book, where they talk about forbidden acts as being exciting, even though their book was primarily focused, A Billion Wicked Thoughts, on sexuality. The same ideas, I think, can be applied to all kinds of different online situations. And then we begin to ask ourselves, perhaps, what can we analyze? And one of the things, of course, is looking at risk online and trying to understand what we can learn from, if we have access to communications, what does that mean? What does that tell us? And beginning to think about putting the pieces together. And totally unrelated to terrorism in her writing is Dr. Pink's 2016 work, looking at what to analyze. She talks about things like experiences or emotions, as well as practices or activities that people do. We can also look at things, the objects, basically, also the different types of relationships in the environment, and the social worlds or the groups and the organizations, the localities where they have sometimes physically shared environment, and other times digitally or online, and also events. And of course, we can apply this in many ways when we start thinking about rituals and ideologies, and also cohesiveness of groups and group formation and planning activities and things of that nature. So we can get a lot of models from outside of terrorism studies and bring those back and study terrorism. So the last slide I have, if you're looking at the PowerPoint, is the future. And the future looks complex and unpredictable. And one of the questions I often have is, how will technology change hate fantasies or interactions and behaviors? How will this all affect us? And according to Dr. Turkle in her 2011 book, to quote from page 160, our online selves develop distinct personalities. And of course, she talks about how we may risk treating others in depersonalized manners. So what do you think? What do you think about all this in terms of how this makes sense, not only to terrorism studies, but how the whole internet, social media, online environments changed everything? And we have plenty of research out there looking at social media, looking at Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram, YouTube, all that. There are lots of studies that analyze all kinds of groups and their presentation and change over time, and comments and who watches, and the meaning systems and interpretations, and what we can learn in terms of using linguistic markers or symbolic analysis. So there's a lot that can be said there as well. You think about how people present online and see. Anyway, it's been over 25 minutes, and so I don't want to go too long on this video, but for the students in the class, I have some readings linked for you, and to me, this is such a fascinating area because this brings everyone together. I mean, we need computer scientists, criminal justice, law enforcement. We need communication specialists. We need sociologists, psychologists. It's so interdisciplinary that we're all really, working together with different pieces of a huge, complex puzzle. And there's really no telling where this will all, where this will take us. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.